Hello, hello. Making sure the microphone works. It does. What's up, Infinity Dev? How you doing, Mr. Papa? How is everybody tonight? Thanks for joining me. My name is Brian Morrison. I'm a software developer based out of Chicago, Illinois. And tonight, I guess I work primarily with Vue and AWS is kind of like my big thing. But tonight, I guess we're going to be doing exactly that. So what I'll be doing is actually building a serverless To Do app entirely in AWS. Vue is a front-end framework built with JavaScript. AWS is my preferred cloud platform. Got 2 certifications in it. Don't use it during the day, but use it at night because I like working with it. So that's what we're basically going to be doing today. We're going to start by generating a small to-do app or a small Vue app and adding some code in it to make it kind of like what the final result's going to be. So we can add to-dos, delete to-dos, show them listed out in there. And then we're going to slowly start building out all the infrastructure manually and up in AWS to save our tasks up in AWS using the different services they offer. We're going completely serverless, so we're not going to be managing any Linux or Windows servers at all. It's all going to be native up in the cloud. And let's hop into it and get started. Actually, I have something I got to do here real quick. But luckily I have everything already set up to fire away. I got to send out those notifications, you know, like when I'm going live, and everyone needs to know when I'm going live. Oh, gotta toss it out into different channels. My keyboard's kind of flaking out tonight, so I might have to grab a cord on that too. I don't know. Okay. All right. Come on, what's going on here? What's that now? All right, cool. So, what is up, Charles? Okay, so what I have so far is just an open folder. There's nothing inside the folder. I got VS Code up here, right? So we can start working on this. We get this little guy out of the way too, so we don't see that all night. So I'm gonna kick in and get started by just creating our app. So I'm gonna open a terminal inside of VS Code here, and let's go ahead and create the Vue app. Vue create to do app, we'll just call it. If you did join me last week, well, I guess first off, this is going to take a little while before it goes. We'll just choose the defaults here. If you were following along last week, we built something like a to-do app, or it was going to be a to-do app. We put that up in AWS using a combination of S3, CloudFront, and as well, we also used GitHub Actions to get everything up there. This was actually supposed to be a part 2 to that, but I decided to completely start from scratch because I realized when we were doing this last week and we were talking about it, it was some good stuff. I explained a lot of good concepts, and that all those videos might go out. I'm not sure. I might just scrap that material and do a part 2 of this next week that kind of covers some of that same stuff along with adding authentication, and we're also going to add image uploads. That's another part that's going to be coming next week. But anyway, so all right, we can see our app is completely is done being created. So you can see I have a folder up here that says To Do App is the name of my app, as well as a bunch of stuff inside of here, right? So inside of source, I guess I can kind of explain a little bit before we jump into it what the different pieces of Vue are. So like I said before, Vue is a front-end framework written in JavaScript. It's primarily JavaScript, but really the reason why I like this over React and Angular is Angular TypeScript. I'm not a huge fan of TypeScript. I should be, considering I work with C# during the day and I like typed languages, but I feel like I just don't like TypeScript. I can't get behind it as much as I try it. So I like that this uses native JavaScript. So that's kind of my big win over Angular. But React, I'm not a fan of the syntax. I don't like how everything is just kind of cobbled together inside of JSX files. I like Vue because everything is nicely compartmentalized in here. You have your HTML template above. So these div tags, this is what's going to define the HTML that's being shown on the screen. Get rid of these notifications. You have the script section, which this is where your JavaScript's going to go inside of here, and this is what kind of controls a lot of the logic part of the app. And then you have your style section down here where you can quickly add your CSS right in the same file. And you can choose between different types of CSS. So there's Sass, there's SCSS, there's less. There's a lot of different plugins that are available for Vue, so you can choose your style of writing CSS however you want. But one of the other cool things about this is you can also add a scoped in front of this, which we're not really going to get too far into this, but basically inside of each one of your Vue files, if you flag it with that scoped flag there, what it'll do is any CSS inside of this file won't affect any other part of your application, which is really nice if you're like just trying to add some classes inside of your thing and you don't want to get super specific with them. It can really make building this thing a lot easier to understand, at least in my opinion. Okay, so let's fire this guy up and just take a look at it. I'll show you what the default Vue app looks like. So we're going to do npm. We're actually going to cd into our folder to do, and we're going to issue the npm run serve command, which is going to fire up a server on our computer and display our code, allow us to pull it up in the browser. Okay, you can see we're running on localhost 8080. So if I go into Firefox here, see I still have some stuff up from last week, and I go to localhost 8080. This is welcome to your Vue.js app. So we have our app, our initial part of our app built. Now let's get into writing some of the code for this. Okay, so I'm gonna go, I lost my spot. Oh my goodness, I completely didn't even add the code in here that I wanted to. Hold on one second, I gotta find my notes. I hope I actually saved what I was supposed to be doing here, because this would make this a little harder if I gotta try and come up with stuff on the fly. Not that I can't do it. I've handled worse while being on stream. It's just I sunk a lot of time and effort into making sure this thing wouldn't be an issue. So just bear with me one sec. This should only take a moment. Here we go. Okay, so I guess I'll be referencing this guy here. So, all right, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to get rid of these two pieces here. We'll delete that. So we just have an open div and a closed div and the ID of app. By default, Vue will kind of build everything off of a div tag with an ID of app. So this has to stay in here unless you want to go and start modifying some of the underworkings of Vue inside of the main.js file, which we're not going to today. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a line in here, or an input, so we can type a task name, and we're going to add a button so we can actually save that task into our, I guess, well, now it's going to be the data property of our JavaScript, but in the future it's going to be, well, like when we're done with this entire project by the end of the night, it's going to be saved up in AWS using the various services we're going to build there. So I'm actually going to just put an h1 tag here. We're going to call this Vue To Do App. And then let's add a div, and we're going to add a class here so we can break this stuff up a little bit. And let's see here. Let's name this class. So I got add task wrapper. I'm typing in the wrong form. You'll see a little bit more what this is going to look like once we're done. So we'll say add task wrapper. Open that, and now we're going to add a button. We're going to input, and we're going to add a button. So let's input. We're going to be a type of text. And it's going to be, we're going to use vModel here. vModel is specific to Vue. This is basically tells Vue inside of the script, I want to bind this specific input to a field inside of script that we can access, and we don't have to write any additional JavaScript for that to happen, which is pretty cool. So we're going to name this new task input, because that's what we're going to name inside of the data. And then I'm also going to add an event here. So we're going to put an @ there, which is the shorthand for whenever an event happens. Keydown.enter, so whenever anybody presses enter inside of this field, we're going to say add task. And a lot of this is going to become a little more clear once we actually get into the scripting portion of this. New task is going to be, like I said, it's going to be just a data property. It's a string variable we're going to bind this to. And then add task is going to be a method that we're going to use to add a task into the list. Okay, so then let's add our button. So we'll say button. And @click, same thing. The event is click. We're also going to say add task. So this will give us two ways to add a task. It's either going to be you can click the button or you can just hit enter. And then let's just say add task, like so. All right, so let's save this and see how we're looking inside of a browser. Oh yeah, I got ESLint running. I gotta get rid of these extra hello world pieces since we're not using them here. But that doesn't really affect the functionality of our app. So this is all we have so far. Just a simple input and a simple button. Now let's add another div tag here, and we're going to name this div class equals task. So that's going to be how we style this, just to make it look a little bit nicer. We're going to use the v-for directive, which is how you would loop over elements inside of the HTML template we have here. So we're going to say for each task in tasks. Tasks is actually going to be inside of one of our data properties as well. This is going to be an array that's going to hold a list of our tasks. And then we also need to define a unique identifier for this, which Vue just uses to kind of track internally and keep performance all working properly. I don't have a very specific explanation on exactly how the key works, but it is required. So we're going to say our key is going to be task.id. So our task is going to be it's going to be an object with two fields. One's going to be an ID, which is just going to be a randomly generated number. And then we're also going to use name for the actual name of the task. All right, so let's close off that div tag, and then inside of here is where we're going to add what this guy's going to look like. So if I add a span here, and close that, nope, not san, we'll say span, close that, and then inside of this first span, double curly bracket is how you would access specific data properties of task in this case, because this is inside of a loop. So task.name is the field we're going to be pulling off. And then we're also going to add a button to the right of this. Did I have a span? No. Class, let's say I got another span here. And we're going to set a class of delete. This is going to be a delete button. And then we'll add a button inside here. So button at click equals, and then we're going to name this method remove task. And then we're actually going to pass in the task.id. So this is going to pass in the unique identifier of the task into our function so we can reference it and pull it off of the array. And then we're just going to put an X inside of there because I don't have any kind of icon library set up here to make this thing look pretty, but an X kind of gives you an idea of what it's supposed to be. So let's save this again. We're not going to notice anything different on here because we haven't added any tasks. So now we need to start adding some of the JavaScript here that's going to let us add these tasks. So I'm going to create what's called the data function here. This is where you can define different data elements, or I guess data fields that you want to bind to inside of the template. So it needs to return an object. So we're going to return, open a curly bracket, and then we're going to have two things inside here. We're going to say new task input, and we'll set that to an empty string, and then we're going to say tasks and set that to an array. And what that more or less corresponds to is new task input is going to, these two are going to be bound together. So whenever I type anything inside of our input field, inside of here, it's automatically going to update this guy here so we can reference it within our methods. Okay, so and then we need to add some methods in here. So to do that, inside of our default export, we're going to add a methods key here and open up a new object. And then here's where we can define all of our JavaScript methods and how we want to execute on the code depending on what we want to do. So we have two. We're going to say, let's see, add task is the first one. We're just going to create stubs of these two functions here. And then remove task is going to be the other one. And then these also correspond to add task is going to correspond to add task here and add task here. And then remove task is going to correspond to this guy here. And I realize we need to pass in the task ID, so we got to set up a parameter for that. Task ID. Okay. So, and then all we really are going to do is, like, when someone adds a task onto here, we're going to create the object inside of here, and then push it up to the tasks array that we have defined here. And then because we have our loop defined in the template between lines 8 and 10, this is going to render it out onto the screen. Let's see, what do we got to do here then? So add task, we'll say let new task equals, we're going to open a curly bracket, we're going to set an ID. We're going to set this to 0 for now. We're actually going to add a quick function in here that's going to give us a random number. And then we'll say name is going to be equal to this, which is important in Vue. Anytime you reference any of these data properties from within the methods, you have to reference them with a this in front of it. So we'll say this.new task input. Task input is that. And then we'll also say this.tasks, same reason, .push, and then we're going to pass in our new task here, like that. So let's save this, and let's test out adding one task into our list here. What do we got? Task ID is defined but never used. Actually, we're going to, I guess we're going to have to comment that out so ESLint stops complaining about us. Hexam, thanks for joining tonight. I appreciate it. If I said your name wrong, please feel free to correct me. Okay, so here's our Vue To Do App. Let's go ahead and try and add a task. Let's say test task. Click enter, and now you can see underneath here we have test task was added. I can throw some other stuff in here too, and you can see we're adding more tasks in here. You know, it doesn't really matter. But this is working, okay? And I don't know if I have the Vue. Let me see if I have the Vue dev tools installed on this machine. It doesn't look like I do. Okay, we'll demonstrate that in another stream because I don't want to take the time and do that right now. Okay, so we have our add task mostly working, but we need to randomize this ID because Vue doesn't like it if you have multiple elements. Usually it throws some console.log errors. Yeah, see here it says duplicate keys found. That's because we're just setting that to 0. So let's head back into our code and let's just add some code in here to create a random number for us. Okay, so let's say let task ID equals math.floor. And then we'll open bracket math.random times. I'm reading this off my notes because I don't remember this off the top of my head, but this basically just creates a random number. So you want 9, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then we'll add 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Like that. So this will give us a random number between basically this 100 million and 999 million, so on and so forth. And then we can assign this in our task ID. Okay, so let's save that. Let's head back into our app. Let's just add a couple tasks in here, make sure it's still working. Open this guy up. These are probably from earlier. Let's test this again one more time just to make sure that we're not getting that same error, which we're not. So that means that that's been done. Okay. Hey, Courtney, how you doing tonight? Appreciate you hopping on. Okay, so again, whenever we execute this method of add task, it's going to create the object here and then push it up into this array, which is going to be rendered out using lines 8 through 9, this v-for loop that we've defined here. The last thing we're probably going to want to do whenever we add a task is to kind of clear that out. So let's just reset our new task input field. So this dot new task input equals just an empty string. So that's going to be reset there. Okay, so that one's done. Now let's go ahead and update remove task. And all this is really going to do is it's going to, when we pass in the task ID, we're going to filter that task out from the table and then update it. So this way, and that's pretty much it. All we're going to do is really filter it out from the array. But once Vue recognizes that that data has changed, it's going to refresh the page automatically for us, and then it'll basically display whatever's in that array then. So let's uncomment this now that we aren't going to run into any issues with this. And all we really need to do, we'll say this.tasks, again, because anytime you reference anything with inside of these data properties here, you have to use this. We'll say this.tasks equals this.tasks because we're going to be referencing the same thing. And we're going to filter, and I'll pass in t. T is going to be my shorthand parameter for tasks. T equal to t.id not equals task ID. So what this is doing is this is going to filter out any tasks, or it's going to filter down our list of tasks to any tasks that do not match the ID that was passed in here. And that, again, is going to be bound into the button that comes to the right of that specific task so we can remove it from the array. And now that that's done, actually, let me save this here. Let's test that functionality out. So we'll add some tasks in here. Okay. I realized I just did exactly the same combination. Let's pick a different one, right? So now, if I click on this guy, and actually, I think we can see what the method looks like on the click. Data button, no, it doesn't actually show it there. Okay, I probably should have installed the Vue tools before this, but that's fine. So now if I click this, you can see it gets removed from the list, right? So now we're back to nothing inside of our array. And as soon as I click it, I didn't have to write any code to re-render the page. It just kind of does it, which is really cool. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some style in here. I'm not going to type all this out because it's just CSS. And I have all my classes should be set up properly. So let's paste all this stuff in here. I'm going to get rid of that scoped tag that we talked about earlier. But all this is really going to do is it's going to kind of spruce it up and make it look a little bit nicer. So I'll save that. And now you can see if I type in a task here, hit add task, it just kind of like keeps everything a little nicer, cleaner looking kind of a thing. Okay, so now that that's done, this is really what the final app is going to look like when we're finished with it, at least tonight. But now comes the fun part, which is wiring all this stuff up in AWS. So yeah, again, we're gonna start by creating a DynamoDB table. DynamoDB is AWS's kind of serverless database storage engine used for, it's a NoSQL thing. It's used for storing documents. So yeah, let's go ahead and hop into that. Let me open AWS here, and let's go ahead and drop down services, and I'm going to search for Dynamo. Yeah, it's gonna want me to sign in again. 1 second here. Whoops. Bear with me for 1 second, just while I get my access keys, I guess. I use multi-factor authentication on pretty much everything, and while it's probably not a concern that I'm bringing up Authy, I'd rather not have to worry about it, so that's why I turned this stuff off. All right, so let's copy that guy in there, paste that, and we're good to go. Okie dokie. So we are at the home page for DynamoDB. This is the view you're going to see if you don't have any tables set up already, which this is a completely fresh tenant, I guess. This is the tenant that I use in AWS that I use when I'm creating content. So usually I'll go through, I'll build stuff, and I just delete it right away when I'm finished doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So let's create a table. I can get rid of that now. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and name this table Vue To Do App, and let's create the primary key of ID, because that's what we're actually going to reference the same ID that we're using here with that random number here. We're going to set that to a number. It's just going to be the data type. Everything else here can pretty much stay the same. We don't need a sort key. We don't need to change any of the default settings. So once we add that in, let's just go ahead and hit create. And I'm going to grab some coffee. All right, so that table is being created. We need to give it a second. This shouldn't take a terribly long time. Okay, there we go. This is really all we need to do here. As you can see, items is where we're going to focus a lot of our stuff into, because we can actually search, we can actually look at the raw data inside of the database, which is pretty nice. This is why I like this. There's a lot of other functionality of Dynamo that we're not even going to touch into. We're really just using it to store data as like a database kind of a thing, because that's what it's for. So now the next thing we need to do is we're going to head over to AWS Lambda, and we're going to create some Lambda functions. Lambda is AWS's serverless compute platform. It is for writing small bits and functions of code that do very, very specific things. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a couple of functions that enable us to save, list, and remove data from DynamoDB. And then that's, at the end of all this, is going to be hooked up to API Gateway, which is going to allow us to access these different Lambda functions through an API endpoint, which is ultimately what our Vue app is going to use. Okay, so let's create a function. We're going to author from scratch. We're going to name our function add to do function. I usually append function at the end of everything. I don't know why. It's just kind of a habit I've gotten into when building things in Lambda. Sometimes I'll shorthand for FN, but you know, that's neither here nor there. So now the other thing we have to change inside here, we're going to use Node.js. We have to change the execution role. So instead of creating one role with basic Lambda permissions, which doesn't really grant us a whole lot, we're going to create a new role from AWS policy templates, but we're not going to actually add a policy to it. And the reason we're doing this, and I'll explain how the role plays in a little bit, is we're going to create one role that's shared across all of our Lambda functions. So I'm going to name this Vue To Do App role. Like that. We'll leave policy templates empty, and we're going to click create function. Oh yes, I forgot. Again, you remember how I said earlier that I use these tenants to, I use this tenant to create stuff and play with it and delete it? Well, while I was testing ahead of the stream, I already had Vue To Do App role, so I'm going to delete that. Let's head back into Lambda and just repeat all that stuff we just did. So under function name, we're going to say add to do function. And then under change default execution role, we're going to say create a role, Vue To Do App role, and then go ahead and create function. Now again, I'm not going to explain how this really works now. We're going to have to go back into IAM, which stands for Identity and Access Management. We're going to have to configure the role, so I'll get a little more into details there. So here we have our function that's been created up in AWS. If you scroll down a little bit while you're in this, you can actually keep scrolling. There's a lot of different options and things that you have available for you using here. The only thing inside of this view we're really going to focus on, there's actually two things, but for now, is the function code section, which is actually a browser-based interface or IDE, integrated development environment. It's a browser-based IDE called Cloud9, which lets you write code directly inside of your browser. You can write code inside of like something like VS Code, zip it up and upload it up into AWS, and they'll extract everything and make it all work. But for our example, we're just going to write all the code right in line here. You can see under index.js is always the default file that Lambda functions are going to look to when they're created at first. And there is a handler function that's being exported from this file. And that's what Lambda is going to use to determine what it needs to execute. Now, you can add other files, link them in here, do whatever you want. But this is very important because this is what's going to handle the event that comes in. Lambda it's an event-based execution platform, I guess you can say. So it doesn't, these codes run when something happens. And something that happens in our case is going to be that HTTP call from our Vue app that says, hey, I want to run this function to create a to-do app, and I'm going to pass in this data, and that data is going to come in from the event there. So I'm actually just going to get rid of all this stuff because we're not going to use any of it. So let's get rid of that. And let's create a new line here. And before I even get into writing any of the body of this function, we're going to add a couple lines here, and I'm going to import the AWS SDK. Const AWS equals require AWS SDK. If I can spell SDK. Spell require right? My headphones turned off. Hold on one sec. That was weird. My headphones randomly turned off. I hope that's not a sign that they're going because I really like these headphones. Okay, so the one interesting thing about Lambda, or I guess AWS as a whole when you're developing for them, is if you're ever trying to write code against AWS and you want to do it locally, you have to install the AWS SDK into your local packages like you would any other NPM. Can't spell SDK. Yeah, I can't. Charles says can't spell. Charles says you can't spell SDK. No, I can't. I don't know how SDK is spelled. I also don't know how AWS is spelled, depending on the day. Back to this. Normally, you'd have to install this as a local function or a local package. But when you're up in AWS, or working with Lambda, Lambda executes functions inside of, I'm going to call it containers, or I don't really know that it's Docker running underneath. In fact, I'm almost sure it's not Docker. It's kind of their own homegrown container execution function. I don't know. But anyway, however you want to think of it, it's running inside of a container, and that container is already preloaded with all the AWS SDKs, depending on the language you're using. So in our case, JavaScript, it already has the JavaScript SDK installed, so we actually don't need to install it inside of our function or our app that we're building. Okay, so now I need to create a client connection up into DynamoDB. So we're going to say const client equals new aws.dynamodb. Is it document client? Document client, like that. So, and this is the object that we're going to use to basically access DynamoDB. So now inside of here, we need to create a response that we're going to send back to the caller. So we'll say let response, and we're just going to set this to an empty object, and we're going to set this more throughout this function. Response equals empty object. Okay. And now I'm going to add a little snippet of code here just to kind of help us along. So this is basically parsing out the HTTP body. Whenever you are using the test tools inside of Lambda, which we're going to see, you can write raw JSON and send it to it. However, whenever API Gateway is making calls in a Lambda, the actual body of it comes in as a raw string that you have to parse out. So all this code here is really doing is kind of checking for both cases. If it's JSON, it just kind of leaves it. If the type of body is a string, it'll convert it to JSON so we can work with it a little bit easier. Now we're going to create some parameters, and these parameters are going to be what's sent into our call into DynamoDB to create our to-do. So the table name is the first thing we need, and that is Vue to Do App. And then we also need to send in the item, which is basically the object that we're working with, and we're just going to pass in the body because that's going to be structured the way that we need it to be. If you're working in a production environment, I would highly advise you to do some kind of like checking of the data that's coming through, so this way you know what it's supposed to be. However, for the case of this of tonight's sample that we're building, then this is sufficient enough. Now we're actually going to try and save the data. So open a try catch block, and inside of the try we're going to await client.put, which is the call you would use to send data into DynamoDB. We're going to pass in our params there, and now by default this put operation is defined as a like an old school JavaScript callback function, and I'm not partial to doing that. I like using the async await method, so I'm going to append on .promise, which basically tells the AWS SDK that I want to return a promise from this operation, and I don't want to pass in a callback function. And why are you complaining? Missing catch. Okay, we're going to put that in next, so that's fine. And then as long as everything worked fine, we can kind of assume that the data was saved properly. We're going to set our response to an object, and we're going to set the status code, which is our HTTP status code, the 201, and I just set 201 because I know 201 maps to created. That's kind of what 201 means. Now we'll catch this error, and then if there is an error, same thing. We're going to change the response object plus set that to equals, and we're going to create a status code of 500 because that means something went wrong. And then I'm also going to add in a body here, and we're going to say we're just going to pass in the error, which is going to send back our error to the caller. Why are you complaining? Response is not defined. Oh yeah, again, spelling. And then once all that is done, the last thing you gotta do is return the response. Response, there we go. And this is basically our Lambda function that's gonna be able to take the data and insert it into DynamoDB. So just to recap, we're creating an empty response. I've got some shim code here, which is going to check to see if the data that's being passed through is a string or a JSON object, and convert it to JSON if it's a string. We have some parameters we're going to pass into the call that we use to save the data. These are passed in here, and depending on whether that succeeds or fails, we're going to return different types of response back to the caller. And this guy's done. So let's bring this in here. So Cloud9 does save automatically, or you can Control S to save it. You can see how it just turned green real quick. That basically means it was saving. And then when you're done, anytime you're done using the built-in editor, you have to click this deploy button, which is going to take your code, and so you can actually do this and save it, and it won't change anything the way your code operates. But you have to click deploy in order for it to take whatever code you just wrote and push it out. Okay. So now, before we can actually test this, we're going to get into that whole role thing we were talking about earlier. Even though AWS is a collection of all these services kind of under one umbrella, every single thing, nothing inside of AWS can talk to each other unless you tell it can talk to something else. So we created a DynamoDB table, and we created a function. We didn't actually tell the function it's allowed, or we didn't tell DynamoDB that it's allowed, the function's allowed to talk to it. So if I tried to use this now, it's going to fail. We have to create a role. So, and then again, I guess the other thing I'll talk about is if you're working with AWS from a developer standpoint and you're doing something from the outside world, you would create a service account inside of users, and then use the public and private keys in order to gain access to different services, and then those would have the policies attached to them. One of the cool things about AWS services, if they're interacting with each other, which in case Lambda and DynamoDB are, you can pass them in a role, which means you don't have to really worry about security keys or anything. As long as you say, like, my Lambda function is going to assume the role of Vue To Do App role, and if I go in here and I add a policy saying you can talk to DynamoDB, specifically this DynamoDB table, it'll work without having to worry about any kind of access keys or passwords or anything like that. That's how everything internally works. So we're going to create an inline policy. I'm going to choose a service of DynamoDB, and I'm going to choose actions. I'm just going to let it have all actions. Again, as a disclaimer, this is probably not best security practice. You would want to go through granularly and select each one of these different operations you know you're going to perform, and only give your role access to what it needs to have access to. But again, beyond the scope of this demonstration. So now that we've set, we want all actions, basically all these different messages we're seeing here is AWS saying we need a little more information on what you're trying to do. So I'm going to go ahead and click Add ARN. ARN inside of AWS is known as an Amazon resource name, and everything inside of AWS has an ARN. It's kind of a unique identifier, not only of a specific service, but some kind of specific configuration inside of that service. So like our DynamoDB table actually has an ARN all of its own. Okay, now let's set this guy up. And this thing comes with an ARN builder that we can use, which we're going to. So under region, I'm going to select any because I don't care about that. Table name is going to be Vue To Do App, because that's the table we created. And backup, I don't care. We'll leave that to anything. And now this is just a process of going through each one of these things and setting all these up like so. So we'll pick that guy, global table name. We'll pass that in there and click add. Index, same thing, all region. Pass our table name in. The index name can be anything. Streams. I'm breezing through these without explaining what they all do because it's not necessary for this demonstration, and there's a good chunk of them I am not totally aware of how they work or what they do. So that incentivizes me to come up with some new content for another stream. Let's go ahead and click add. Okay, so now that all of our error messages are gone and everything like this is set up as it should be, request conditions, we don't need to worry about any of that stuff. So we'll go ahead and click review policy. We need to give our policy a name, so we'll do Vue To Do App policy. And I like to add an underscore at the beginning of this so I know this is a custom policy that I created. Not that I would expect AWS to create a policy called Vue To Do App policy, but it's just a naming convention that I've grown to like. Okay, so this is it. Our policy is now created, or our policy is now defined. Now it's created and it's attached underneath our Vue To Do App role. You can see now we have the Vue To Do App policy we just created. And now I can head back into Lambda and I can test my function. So let's open To Do function. There are no test events that have already been pre-selected or predefined, so we're going to configure one. We're not going to use a template, but we are going to, inside of here, pass in body, because that's the object we expect the event to have if it's coming from API Gateway. And we'll pass in an ID of 1234 just as a test, and then a name of test task. And provided, format that, make sure that's good. And we're going to say test add task. We have to give our task a name without spaces, apparently. Test add task. Okay, let's go ahead and create this. Now you can see next to our test button, we have test add task. And if we click test, what it's going to do is it's going to send the content of that event into our Lambda function to process. And this is a way, like if you're modifying the stuff inline, you want to test it before you actually like go and start building everything else. Click test, and it'll tell you right up here whether it succeeds or fails. In our case, we got to succeed. If I scroll down here, you can see the response from this function was a status code of 201. So that means our task was created. And now I can actually see this if I go back into DynamoDB, open up our table, and head over to items. Here's the data that we just sent it. We have an ID of 1234, and we have the name of test task. So now we know that function is working properly. Okay. I feel like I said a lot in a short amount of time, and I spoke very quickly. So now we're going to head back into Lambda. Let's finish creating our last couple of functions here. I'm going to create a function called list to-dos functions. Scroll down, and now the only difference here is under the change default execution role, we're going to use an existing role, and then we're going to select our Vue To Do App role. So we don't have to go and modify that or do anything else to it. It's been created, it's been defined, we can just reuse it. Let's create the function, and I'm just going to paste in my demo code here instead of going through the process of explaining what everything does. A lot of it's the same thing. You can see we have a response, we have some params. We're not actually taking anything from the body, so I don't have my shim code in here. I'm using client.scan instead of client.put. And then I'm inside of the response, I'm also tacking on a body, and then I'm going to convert my data items that are retrieved back from DynamoDB into a string, because that's how Lambda kind of expects you to return it if you're using API Gateway. So now if I save this, actually let's Control S to save and deploy it. We can configure, I'm going to say empty event, because that doesn't matter. Delete all that stuff. Let's create, it's going to let me create it. No, it needs something. So we'll just, I guess, pass in an empty object. Create that guy. Click test. And if I scroll this down here, you can now see in the body of the response, I have it's an array with an object inside of it. Is our task that we just created through our previous test with the ID of 1, 2, 3 and test tasks. Now this function's already set up and done, ready to go. Let's create our last function. Let's say delete task function. This is the last thing we want to set up here. Same thing, select the role we defined earlier, create the function, and got a whole lot more of the same code here. So let's scroll down here, select all, and paste in the delete to do function. Again, the only difference we're really doing here is instead of we're passing in a key with the ID of body. We're taking basically the body that comes in from API Gateway. It's going to have a key inside of there, or I'm sorry, it's going to have an ID with the ID of the task we're trying to delete, and then we're going to pass that in with the params into client.delete, and then provided everything works, we will delete it. We're not going to test this one because I don't have that set up and ready to go. So let's save that and deploy it, and I guess we'll real world test this, I guess you can say, by using API Gateway. Okay, so now if I go back to functions, you can see I have all 3 of our functions defined. So now we have to set up API Gateway, and what is that? API Gateway is Amazon's or AWS's way of allowing you to do certain things inside of AWS through an API endpoint. It's like if you want to create a public API, that's the service you want to use, and you can wire it up to do a lot of different things. The main thing that I've really used it for is just Lambda functions to be used as an HTTP API for CRUD operations. Create, read, update, delete is what that stands for. But I know there's more capabilities that even I haven't explored yet. So to go to API Gateway, we'll drop down services. We'll go to search for API Gateway, and we'll go there. And this is the new interface for API Gateway. I've never seen this up until working on it a couple of days ago when I was creating this content. But API Gateway is, yeah, this is what we're going to build now. Hey, Danny, what's up, man? Glad to have you on stream. Okay, so we want to create an HTTP API. So let's click build on this guy. And now we want to add some integrations to it. And again, we're going to integrate our Lambda functions in with API Gateway. So click Add Integration. We're going to select Lambda. We're in the US East 1 region. Everything I'm doing tonight is in US East 1, so we can leave that just as is. And you can see if I click on here, where the Lambda functions, it actually shows me my Lambda functions that I have available for me to use. So I'm going to click on Add To Do function. We're going to do this for every single one of our Lambda functions we just created. Delete To Do function, and the last one is list to do functions. And we're going to create an API name here. We'll say Vue To Do App API. And click Next. So now it'll display our integrations that we've already set up, and now we can configure the different routes that we want our API to take. Now I'm actually, so you can do a couple things. So if you can pass in any, so this way it doesn't matter what data you pass in, as long as you would use like whatever the API or URL for our API is /add to do function would map to the add to do function. Delete task. I used the wrong name for my function, but that's fine. Yeah, but what I'm instead going to do is I'm going to change all these to to-dos because it's normal for APIs to have a pluralized version of a resource, in this case a resource being our to-do, as the path. And then I'm going to use the HTTP methods to define what I want to do for each one of these. So for add to-do function, we're going to use post. For delete task function, we're going to use delete. And then for list, we're going to use get. Okay, that's all done. Let's click next. Stages are kind of cool. Like if you were using, if you wanted to define different stages of your API, like dev, test, QA, production, you know, this is where you would do that. Now, again, since we're just doing this as a simple example, we're going to leave this as default, and we're going to make sure that auto deploy is turned on. So any change that we make to our API gateway configuration will automatically be published. We don't have to worry about deploying like we do with Lambda. Let's leave that as is, click next, and this is just a quick review page. We'll click create on the bottom. I'm gonna grab some coffee real quick again. All right, so our API is now created, and you can see the next screen we get an API URL that we can use to invoke our different functions. So I'll copy this out, and we're actually gonna head over to Postman now. Postman is a tool I use to test APIs. It's a tool that a lot of people use to test APIs. It's a great tool. Let's create a new request here, and we're just going to paste in the URL that we have here. And remember, when we defined the routes in here, we set to-dos for everything. So we're going to set that / to-dos, and we'll click send. And you can see in the response, let's switch this around. I like side-by-side view a little better. There we go. You can see inside of the response body, I have my data. And when we wire this, the next phase after we're done testing all this and making sure it works, we have a little bit more configuration, is we're going to wire up all of our fetch requests inside of the Vue app to show this thing, you know, fully integrated into everything that we just set up in AWS. So that data looks to be working properly. Let's go ahead and try and add a to-do. I'm going to paste that in again. Actually, I'm going to have to paste this in a couple times, so we'll just copy it with the to-dos because I'm lazy. We'll change our action to post. Let's expand this out a little bit so I can see all these tabs here. Under body, we're going to set that to raw. We're going to change this to JSON, and let's pop open a new object here. We're going to set the ID. So we can't use 1, 2, 3, 4 since we used that already in our test. So let's do 5, 6, 7, 8 because why not? And we'll set the name of the task to test from Postman. And let's go ahead and click send. And you can see up in the right-hand corner here, I got a 201 created, which means our task was created inside of the database. If I go back and issue my Git request to list them all out, here's our new task that we created, right up here. And then obviously if it's there, then that means it must be inside of Dynamo. So we'll head to Dynamo, open our items, and here's our one that we just created. And then let's delete that test task, okay? So let's create a new call here, change this to delete, and under body we're going to do the same thing. We'll change this to raw, change that to JSON, and let's pass in an ID of 1, 2, 3, 4. Go ahead and click send, and you can see I got a 200 OK, which means it should be deleted. If I issue my Git request again, 1, 2, 3, 4 is gone. So our API is all working. Now there's actually one more step we need to do inside of API Gateways configuration before we can do this, and that's to set up CORS. For those who aren't aware, CORS is this, it's a security feature inside of browsers where before it actually issues a request, it'll check with the API and say, hey, am I allowed to do what I'm going to try and do before I do it? And we basically have to tell API Gateway that whatever our app is going to try, I mean, again, in a perfect world, if you were doing something for production, you'd want to set up specific origin points for CORS. So like if you knew that your app is only going to be calling your API from the domain name that you've specified, you'd want to set that here. However, we're just going to go ahead and change this to star for all these guys because for this demonstration, we really don't care where our requests are coming from because by the time this is over, I'm going to delete all this. So we'll add all this guy and all this stuff in here. We can see we have stars underneath everything here, and we'll go ahead and click save. Danny, I saw your message. I apologize that Streamlabs deleted it. Sorry, I don't know. I haven't fully set up the Streamlabs bot, but yeah, I appreciate the compliment and all the fire you threw my way. All right, so now that that is done, okay, so now we can actually integrate this into our to-do app. So let's go back into our code, and we're actually going to add an extra call here. So underneath data, I'm going to set created, and created is what's called a lifecycle hook in Vue. Basically, Vue has some default functions and methods that it executes every time certain events happen. The created one in specific is going to execute anytime that a component is created. Basically, whenever you pull up your Vue app, it's going to pull in all the different components you have defined. And it's going to create them or render them on the screen. So anytime this component is rendered, it's going to call the created function. So that means inside of here, actually, we got to convert this to an async. That means inside of here is where we would issue our request to pull all of our to-dos in. So I'm actually going to grab in our URL here, and we're going to say let response equals await fetch, and then we'll pass in our URL here, which is going to call in our to-dos. And then we're going to say let JSON equals, I guess we could do let tasks equal list.tasks. Tasks is equal to await res.json. So the body that comes in is going to look something like this. So we know we're getting an array back, and we're going to get our tasks inside of each of one of those. So this is going, whenever this app loads, then it's going to pull in the data from AWS and then display it and render it on the screen for us to work with. So save that. See, Danny says it's all good. We need to get you more people on these streams. Let me know we could stream. Oh yeah, for sure, man. Let's do it. You come up with a topic, you pitch it to me, we'll do it for sure. I hear you work a lot with Angular, so you could probably teach me a thing or two about Angular. I'd totally be down for that. Okay, so actually, you know what? Before we even move on any further, if I open my terminal, it's not plenty of responses assigned to value. Res is not defined. Where res? Did I fat fingers? Okay, so actually, ESLint's complaining to me, wants me to change that to const, and I did actually. Res is something I commonly use for response, and that was done more or less out of habit. So I'll save that, and then we'll head back into our Vue app. And we can see here's our test from Postman, actually. So this is the task that's still defined here. Now we have one of the three functions already set up. So now we need to modify these other two functions, the add task and remove task, to basically, when we remove it, we're still going to do the same thing. We're removing it from our local data, but we're also going to tell the API to say, hey, remove this from the database so it doesn't get pulled in again. I'm sorry, now we're in add task. Let's see here. So instead of, we're going to do task.push, but we're also going to do await fetch, and then we'll pass in same thing, our URL here. I just knocked my mouse all over the place. That's nice. And then we're also going to pass in an object here, which is where we would define some of the, I guess, extended parameters we'd want. So we're going to set the method to post, and then we're going to change the headers. We're going to add some headers, and we're going to say content type is application /JSON. This is common if you're sending JSON data to an API, so it knows what to expect out of it. And under body, we're just going to pass in new task like so. Okay, so now let's save that, and let's try this out. Why did I do that right? It should, we actually need to stringify it. That's right, JSON.stringify. Remember how I said API Gateway expects things to come in as strings? This is one of those gotchas that will throw you off if you're working with the stuff for the first time. As you can see, I've been working with Lambda for a couple years now, and I still forget to do it. I actually have a lot of wrappers around my Lambda functions, which is why I don't work with this stuff all that often directly. So I'll go ahead and save that, and let's test this out. Let's see, await, last thing we need to do, when we created these functions earlier, we did not set these to async functions, so we just got to throw the async keyword in front of there. And let's test this. Test from Vue. And let's go ahead and click enter to add a task. And now we have test from Vue inside of our list, which means I would expect it made it up into AWS. So as always, we're going to go to dynamodb. We're going to check it manually. And we have test from Vue right there. And you can see this is our random ID that we've generated. So every time a task is created, it'll generate a random ID like that, so we don't have to worry about any kind of conflicts. You really would probably want to use some kind of library to generate those IDs, but this works for our demonstration here tonight. Let's see. Pepcac says collaborations, thinking of doing a Vue panel. Yeah, I'd totally be doing. I've watched some Eric's. I'm not sure. I've never heard of Gwen Faraday, but I've seen some of Eric's content. He does some pretty good stuff. Yeah, I'm totally down, man. Let's do it. All right, so we have our add. Last thing we need to do is we need to set up our remove task. So we're going to do await fetch. Same thing. We'll pass in. Actually, I'm going to copy all of this and bring this down here. We're still going to need headers actually, because what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the ID, and we're going to say task ID. This is going to be the JSON object that we're passing up into our API to tell it to delete it. We need to stringify it just like we did before, and we also need to change our method to delete. And let's save that. Now let's head back into our To Do app, and same thing. We need to async this function. Okay, our Vue app's refreshed. We pulled that data. Let's go ahead and delete our test from Postman. Click that button. Alrighty, all right. That seemed to go away. And let's go ahead and refresh our data here, and you can see our test from Postman is completely done. So that's the stream in a nutshell. We did it all. All right, let's see what we got here. Pepcake says, how much space will this allow? Is there a limit to the tasks? There's no limit to the tasks per se. If you have a lot of tasks, your performance, your application is going to slow down quite a bit. So you need to account for that. And it's where you would try and implement something like pagination into your API. We're saying like, hey, I want to request, only 100 tasks at a time, and I want to skip these tasks. So that would be the approach I'd probably do there. As far as data size, actually, that is a good question. I want to say the maximum record size in DynamoDB is something like 256K. That is a damn good question. 400K is the maximum item size inside of DynamoDB. And the reason for that, if I remember back when I was studying all this material, is DynamoDB is automatically globally distributed, I think I remember. So whenever you send something up to DynamoDB and it writes it for the first time, it'll create it in different locations throughout AWS. So this way, if service A has an issue over here for DynamoDB, service B will pick up the slack. If you're storing anything that's more than 400K, what you'd really want to do is like kind of render your object and store it inside of S3, and then store the reference to that object inside of DynamoDB. That obviously comes with some performance implications as well, because every time you're calling, basically you'd call DynamoDB to get an index of all your records, and then you have to call individually to S3 to pull all that stuff down. So yeah, I mean, there definitely are performance considerations, but for small applications, it's once you get, and hey, look, everything I did tonight was very manual, very clickety-click all the way around and step this stuff, setting everything up. This is not something I was planning on talking about, but there is a feature of AWS called CloudFormation, which I use whenever I'm building applications with a library called the Serverless Framework. And what CloudFormation does is it lets you basically define all of your infrastructure inside of, you could either use YAML or you can use JSON. And when you tell AWS saying, hey, I want to build this stack with this CloudFormation definition, it'll go and crawl out and just create all the resources you've defined, which is pretty cool. But the other neat thing that it does is if you ever want to update your stack by adding services or changing the configuration of certain things, you just change your CloudFormation template, you redeploy it, and AWS is smart enough to notice and detect the changes, and then it'll only change the things that you've requested it to. So realistically, as much as I love working with AWS, I don't work too intimately with the UI. A lot of the stuff that I build is all defined as code. So have you ever heard the term infrastructure as code, which Pepcake, I'm sure you have, since you've been in the industry for a while. That's kind of what that means, is I would take my template, upload it here, and let CloudFormation kind of handle all the heavy lifting of creating all my different services and stuff. Okay, so again, that is it. That's all I have for tonight. So I appreciate everyone who joined me tonight. This was pretty cool. You know what? This is one of my largest streams, so I'm pretty happy right now, and I was very satisfied with the way that all the material came out when I finished writing it. So that leads into next week. So I mean, knock on wood, provided nothing major comes up, we're going to part 2 this one instead. So there's a couple things we're going to do. We're going to add authentication using AWS Cognito. In fact, I'm not on there anyway. We're going to add authentication using AWS Cognito. We're also going to add image uploading. So that's going to be like Pepcake, you were asking, if you want to store large objects alongside, within your app, you would store them in S3. So what we're going to do, I think, is we're going to take, I'm going to create some Lambda functions that are going to allow us to upload images into S3 and then reference them inside of our tasks here. So that's going to be pretty cool. And then the last thing we're going to do is kind of recap what we did last week, where we deploy this thing out to S3 and CloudFront and just distribute it. So this way anyone can pretty much get and access it, which might be kind of dangerous, because that means, and I might even just post this in the chat, be like, hey guys, go crazy. Start putting some stuff on stream, demonstrate, see how this stuff works. So yeah, that is all. That's all I got for the night. So I appreciate everyone who joined me. I'm actually thinking in my Discord server, which if you're welcome to join, fullstack.chat. We're a small growing group of developers and normal people who just chat about dev primarily, but also other stuff. We got a lot of pet pictures, a lot of memes and music, a lot of cool stuff going on there. We're a pretty fun crew. But the biggest thing, the main reason I started is just for developers to be in a nice, friendly environment where they can get help with whatever. It doesn't matter the experience you got. But what I think the reason why I go into that is because if you need help with it or have questions, that's the easiest way to get in contact with me. I also think I'm going to jump into the voice channel in there. So if you're interested in joining me on that, just kind of chat with me instead of just listening to me. I'd love that. So again, I'm done. You all have a good evening. Bye-bye.